Hello my fellow human beings. In this video I'm going to show you the making of process of a sort of soft, light forest green cotton voile broderie dress with a bunch of flowers all along the neckline and maybe also one in my hair, which I've got quite a bit of. Flowers of course aren't very groundbreaking, but in my opinion they can be worn anytime. The same with sort of broderie and lace type of fabrics, by the way. I once wore a lace wrap top to a job interview. It was a very casual interview at a supermarket and my boss was wearing scrubs and jeans. But later on I posted the outfit on Reddit and people were like, "You wore lace to an interview? You didn't wear a boring black suit and a white shirt? How dare you?" And I just totally was like, what kind of conservative hellhole do you come from? They did not appreciate that. But yeah, lace, flowers, anytime, anywhere, in my opinion. So without further ado, let's get into the making of this dress. So these are the pattern pieces ready to make the prototype. I put markings all over the leg because there are these very long vertical pieces, so at the underbust, at the waist, at the hips, at where the slit is going to be. I'm only going to put a slit in the side seam, but I also marked at points just to make sure, just to have an extra point, and also the knee, which is about 60 centimeters below the waist. So yeah, this is for a prototype, so I don't have a lining pattern yet and also don't have facings yet. The facings, I'm going to do the armpits and the neckline in one, so I'm going to have something like this. Of course without the seam allowances with the pieces attached, and the same at the front, so I will just have a facing going like this. Anyway, I got out an old bedsheet and made a prototype. As you can see right here, just randomly trying it on in my room. This old bedsheet turned out to be a little bit loosely woven. It didn't have any elastic in it. It was just a fine cotton, but in the end it's ended up behaving quite differently from my final other fabric, because I ended up using this as lining, because as you can see, it's pretty good. Except in the waist, it is a little bit too big. I could grab quite a bit of extra that wasn't seam allowance in the back and in the side where I put the opening in the prototype. It was also more than my seam allowance and I pinned, so I ended up taking the waist about 2 centimeters. The contouring around the bust was quite good, which I was happy with. And the back at the top, I found it to be a little bit too baggy, so I took that in, and also, as you can see, the shoulder straps. Shoulder straps being annoying is a pretty common problem for me. In the end though, because as I said, it turned out that this fabric was a little bit more loosely woven than my final fabric. Taking in the shoulder straps actually wasn't necessary, also with the extra bulk, with there being more seams and such. But yeah, in this stage I also ended up shortening the shoulder straps a little bit. With the slit I was also happy. I could just walk around easily, that was like no issue. So yeah, it was pretty great, and as I said, I ended up using it as lining, which was maybe not the best idea. You'll see later. I altered the pattern pieces a little bit, I made facings, and now it is time to cut out. As you can see, I really just was like, okay, what can I get out of this fabric? And I concluded that a 6-panel dress with lots of vertical seams can get out of this fabric. As you can see, quite a bit of it is actually not very usable. I mean, this fabric is totally fine, it is a very nice voile, but to have like half a piece suddenly be without embroidery, of course, can't happen, so I had to take that into consideration when deciding how wide the skirt could be. And yeah, this is just about the seam allowance is in the plain parts, but I am using the plain parts for the facings, as you can see. except for one. It couldn't fit here. And then I have this empty piece over, except that it isn't actually empty. On it I drew a bunch of very long, narrow trapeziums in order to make roses. Because, you see, the thing is, I've always been into fashion. And as a child I drew lots of, in retrospect, quite amazing things. But with age came realism, and I didn't really pursue fashion design. I pursued fashion technology as my bachelor's, which is a lot more commercial and practical and just purely learning the theory and the techniques. I learned to sew nice finishes, and I learned basic pattern drafting techniques, but not really much design. And also, of course, realism in terms of, I shouldn't use too much fabric. I should make quite relatively plain styles that are wearable and versatile, but it just isn't really exciting. And I feel like I haven't really been challenging myself enough to really push the boundaries like an actual designer would, to look for things that are exciting. And not that this is very exciting, because of course I have this fabric limitation of this coupon. This is 1.80 meter. It was the last bit, I couldn't get any more. But I still want to do something more, you know. So at an internship I did, on the last day of the internship, I got the assignments to try to figure out a way how to make nice fabric roses. So I and another intern looked up a bunch of tutorials and we just started experimenting. It was actually quite fun, except for the fact that it was my last day, and I also was very sick. I had a cold, I was sneezing every 5 seconds. So, and I want to incorporate that as the thing that makes it a little bit more extra, a little bit more special. So I plan to make all these sort of rose ruches. Maybe I will like it enough to make actual appliques out of it. But for now my plan is to make brooches out of it. And yeah, I have the lines drawn down here for 6 or so of them, and I will see how that works. Before I could start with the sewing, I of course had to finish the edges of my prototype, which I would use as lining. I did some of the alterations I mentioned and redyed the whole sort of dress into this khaki green, which looks quite neutral and nice underneath the green broderie fabric. I just always did the 2 halves of the seam, so the seam allowance of the left piece and the seam allowance of the right piece. I always serged them together, except for the slits. There I was quite careful to do the 2 seam allowances separately. And then I did the same thing for the maid fabric, where I just serged all of the separate pieces all around. Before I could serge these, I of course had to first interface the facing pieces. Then I did this thing where I basically only serged the sort of side seams of the facing pieces, where they would be attached to each other. I stitched and ironed the seams, this only being the front yet. As you can see, the top edge and the bottom edge are just a neat line, so I'm going to serge these when they're all attached together. I continued with stitching on the back pieces, and then ironed again and serged all the edges, of which this is the result. I made this nice facing, all the edges nicely finished, and it was all for nothing. I was supposed to cut this center front facing on the folds, and I didn't, which basically meant that it's like I used seam allowance when there wasn't any seam allowance included. So it was too short, so I added this wedge of fabric in between. It is also interfaced, so I didn't bother overlocking it because in the end these edges will be hidden, and it is sturdy enough for such a small piece. Well, after that is fixed, what I'm doing now is I will stitch this facing onto the lining. So yeah, this is the lining, this sort of khaki green. It's actually my prototype, but I dyed the color because bright white really isn't my thing. So yeah, this will just be stitched all around so the facing and the lining are attached. After that, it was time to fold under the bottom edge of the facing, iron it of course, and then stop stitch it so it is all neat and nicely finished there. I already did it at the side seams to have a sort of reference. Here it is all finished. With all that done, it was time to do the thing I had been avoiding, namely stitching all the main fabric pieces together in these long vertical seams. I didn't need to stitch all of these seams all the way. For example, the center back would only be stitched from the hips downwards, because there was going to be a zipper from the neckline to the hips. With that done, I pasted in the zipper in the center back. With a blind zipper hood, I stitched in the zipper and then also stitched the lining onto the zipper, which I also first pasted in. It is very much still open around the neckline, the armholes and the bottom at this point, so I could sort of finagle the lining seam allowance onto the zipper and main fabric seam allowance. Then I sort of twisted and turned the whole thing and managed to get the lining with the facing on it and the main fabric right sides together, so I could stitch all along the neckline at 1 cm seam allowance. Having done this, I came to the point when I had a garment that I could actually put on my body. I quickly discovered a couple of things. As I mentioned earlier, the lining somehow grew in comparison to the main fabric, like the lining was looser woven. Some spots, especially the armholes, were quite snug, because this version is interfaced and has a lot more stitches, keeping it all together and not allowing it to stretch out on the bias, because armholes are always a little bit on a bias. It turned out that I took in the armholes on the prototype a little bit over enthusiastically. Before I did anything to the armhole, I thinned out the seam allowance of the neckline in order to understitch it and already make that whole area cleaner. Which I then indeed understitched, of course. As you can see here, I also cut in the armhole, or at least the lining side, in a little bit deeper in order to make them more comfortable. Then it was time to stitch the armhole, which was still possible to do right sides together since the bottom hem was open and would stay open. Of course, it has this very sausagey look and it was pretty hard to do. I mean, come on, this looks ridiculous. As I didn't hate my life yet, I was not going to understitch this, and instead I just ironed it. With everything else done, it was time to start on the slits and the hem. I noticed my lining was somehow a little bit wider and longer than my upper fabric, even though it uses the exact same pattern, which is weird. But those were worries for later, I thought at the time. The first thing I did was hemming the main fabric's hem, just a quite simple rolled hem, as small as possible. I also hemmed the lining with a bigger seam allowance because I wanted it to be shorter for obvious reasons. I used 2 cm seam allowance and folded it under twice, so all the edges were neatly tucked away. Then I stitched the side seam allowance of the main fabric and the lining together in order to fixate things a little better, make them a little bit sturdier. And yeah, so I stitched it together until a couple of centimeters above where the slit starts. The final hems looked something like this. It was time to sew the slits, or rather my first attempt. I again sort of moved about my fabric so the lining where the slit should be and the main fabric were right sides together, and then I just stitched them together at 1 cm seam allowance. These seams I then understitched. I tried it on again in the meantime, and there were a couple of things that still weren't quite right. First up, the armholes were somehow still too snug, which is a mystery to me why, because this comes from the exact same basic block than things I already made and wear and are perfectly comfortable, made from similar fabrics. So, the heck happened here? But anyway, I deepened the armhole a little bit more and it was finally right. The fit was pretty good. I mean, it is snug, but it is supposed to be snug as it is supposed to be worn braless. So I didn't mind it at all, it still felt comfortable. But the main problem were those damn slits. As I said before, the lining somehow grew. It's the exact same pattern, but it is wider, it is longer, and it is just not cooperating. So the lining sort of picked from underneath the main fabric on all sides, and it really needed to be fixed. The first step at my attempt to fix this was simply trimming off the seam allowance and restitching it, so the hem would be the seam allowance shorter. Then I looked at how much wider the lining is on the upper fabric when laid flat and decided to add that amount to the seam allowance. I ironed it carefully and then made sure to retrace my steps of stitching it right sides together and understitching it. It looked all nice and neat, but unfortunately the lining was still peeking from underneath. This is the exact same technique as I used on something I made before, where a slit looks totally fine. So, but no worries, I had an idea. I had previously cut out these very long narrow trapeziums for the flowers. I was still going to make these flowers, but I had quite, well, not a lot, but I had some fabric left, which was enough fabric and of the right length for me to be able to make some gauze the length of the slits. It will be a different direction, the warp instead of the weft, but the fabric didn't behave too differently in the two directions, so it would be perfectly fine. So yeah, I measured the length of my slits and cut out some more narrow long trapeziums for the gauze. All of these I still had left for the flowers. After serging the pieces, I started their construction. Every sort of gore on each side existed out of a back and a front piece. These I would stitch together in the middle for about 15 centimeters for now. The rest of the center seam was finished with a top stitch. Now, gores, even with some seam allowance, are usually triangles, not trapeziums, but I decided to pleat the top a bit in order to have more volume. Before I could do anything with those gores, however, there was a whole evening of the quite annoying task of seam ripping the original slits. None of the slits stayed intact. The only part that stayed intact was the fixation stitch on the side seam above the slits. So here we are again, with the split seams ripped once again. I took a bit of a pause, well, only of one day to be specific, because after seam ripping the same seam twice, and it is also very specifically a part that's like the second to last thing you have to machine, so it's quite demotivating. So yesterday I just spent the day video editing, making my Sims family tree, writing down my Sims story, but also a lot of video editing. I've done productive things, even though creative writing is also a productive thing to do. But anyway, this is the split, as you can see. Here they're attached, but here the lining and the upper are separate. And here is one of my weird slits gore thingies. So this is going to be pleated a bit to give extra volume on the sides. And this part, the last part, I'm going to separate it and just sew it in, right side to right side basically, as you normally would. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, right side to right side, and then it's like going to look like this with this being too much fabric. I am going to pleat it in, and then I will go over it with extra strong, just short stitch to fix it all. This is the back side of the gore. The two pieces have slightly different widths, and the wider part I use for the back. And this is of course also the back side of the skirt, and it is all pinned, ready to sew. Here I also undid my hemming a bit in order to be able to sew it more neatly, and then I will hem this again as one piece. So the gore is attached. As you can see, I ironed the seams and I pinned the fabric the way it should be pinned, and I also ironed it. Now let's look at the other side. So yeah, as you can see, it is looking a bit weird, vaguely reminding me of certain body parts, but I can reshuffle it a bit in a way that it looks right, like if I close the pleat more. So yeah, I will reshuffle this a bit, repin it a bit, and come back to you later. So here we are again. What I did is basically make it into one pleat, instead of having like the three little pleats like I had at first, because this will be less bulky and look cleaner in the end. I ironed this here a bit, and I will just stitch along here. The lining was finally invisible, but the slit still needed some fine-tuning. So I top stitched the slit on one side just to test it, and I also undid the stitch here, as that very much seemed to be part of the problem, and it hangs quite nicely. So I'm going to do it like this. I'm also going to top stitch here, and I think I will initially keep the stitch here on the other end just because it is easier to stitch on this way. But then I will also undo this stitch on the other side, and then the dress parts, so everything but the floral appliques, is essentially done. Of course I would also need to rehem it, but that's a quick and easy thing. Finally, the slit was looking fine, so it was time to start with the flowers. I folded over a corner of my trapezium on the smaller end and simply stitched closed this corner. When I was at the corner point, I twisted around the fabric a little bit so the two edges of the trapezium meet up. Then I just continued like this, right side to right side, the two edges together. Along the way, I changed my stitch length to the maximum stitch length on my machine, so I could gather the trapezium later on, because gathering was a very essential part of the flower making process. I turned the sausage right sides out and gathered it, and then, holding the edge where it is stitched together, I sort of started rolling up the fabric, getting a sort of rose shape. Look at her, isn't she pretty? I still have to finish the backside though. Before I continue with the flowers, these are all the scraps I have left of the fabric in the end. Like, this is it. The flowers were a matter of hand sewing, which I could peacefully do in front of Netflix or YouTube. With the matching threads, I just went through the back of the flowers a bunch, pulling the edges together, refining my technique over time as the flowers progressed. I placed the flowers onto the dress with the biggest one in the middle, the medium ones next to the big one, and then the smallest ones on the ends. And then it was of course time to properly start sewing them on. First I did a stitch between more the center of the flower and the main fabric, and then I just started going all around the perimeter needle through flower, needle through fabric. Needle through flower, needle through fabric, round and round and around. And in the end, so back at the beginning, I went through the same place a couple of times and circled my threads around my needle and made a knot that way. Ta-da!